Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you our first of our major key battles we're going to look at on the Western Front. And this one will be Battle of the Somme. This is going to be a four-part series, and we delve into first the background and preparations, the opening events on the first day, the wider conflict and campaign as a whole, and of course, summarizing and bringing it all together. As always, it is important to stress that these lessons are catered towards students at the GCSE and A level, and so because of that, the content provides key knowledge and, of course, includes some historical skill practice as well. So, of course, we do that. Do bear that in mind. There's an introductory content. There's always more to learn, always more to study with history. So, of course, do bear that in mind as you are taking part. So, with that in mind, notepads and pens at the ready. Let us begin. So first off, as I say, this is the video going to be covering the background and preparation. We're going to lead in to what the conflict was like after the situation and the stalemate has set in back in early 1915. So of course, those of you who have took part in those classes or watched those videos will of course already know that we've gone over the trench systems and of course understand that the stalemate has set in place. And so we're going to go forward now and see how the British leadership adapted, what issues they faced in 1915 that led to some significant changes to occur by the time we get to 1916. First off, we have the lead up here to the Somme. So the British Army, they've been facing many problems on the Western Front as we established. This stalemate had set in, and they had all these big supply problems. They had to build trenches, living in less than ideal conditions. But something we've not fully touched upon yet was what was actually going on up top. We've done a very bottom up history currently, the situation for the soldiers. But what about the bitterness and disagreement between the generals? Well, in 1914, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, was commanded by Sir John French, the gentleman on the left. And he had a lot of friction with his second in command, Douglas Haig, the gentleman in red, on the right. Haig actually was very, very famous for criticizing John French and his leadership. He was blaming him for a lot of the failures and a lot of the issues that they had faced in the conflict so far. He actually was an extract from his diary where he openly said that he thought French was ignorant of all the essential principles of warfare. And to Haig's credit, this seemed to be turning out to be the case. On the surface, John French was making many blunders. He initiated an attack at a place called Aubers Ridge in May 1915, meant to be a big offensive to try and drive the Germans back. But the artillery fire, the shells, they failed, they detonated incorrectly. The charge became a massive massacre for the British and did not go so well. John French refused to accept this, and he said it wasn't his fault, it was the shells. There had been an ongoing shell crisis, and he blamed the production of the shells for the incident. And there was some truth to this. Some of the fuses were faulty, not every shell detonated. So he was given a second chance, and another offensive was permitted at Loos in September, which Haig also took part in. But this faced similar issues. The frontline attack from the British did not break through. They made many errors on the battlefield, and it was quite chaotic. One veteran of the war afterwards, Basil Liddell Hart, wrote how it was a carnage, how the soldiers were charging out into the open, but they were mowed down by machine guns, and officers couldn't control their men. They were being slaughtered left, right, and centre, and it was all, in essence, a massive failure. Coupled with that, the artillery again was not very successful, and this became the last straw for John French and his leadership. French was considered a blundering fool by now. He fell in lots of controversy, and the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, insisted on his resignation. It did not help that thousands of Britons had died, and roughly 165,000 casualties were suffered in the offensives. So, with that in mind, John French was, of course, forced out, and Haig replaced him as Commander in Chief of the British Expeditionary Force. With it, he gained control of a now growing and quite sizable army. By this point, in September into November of 1915, the infantry was roughly 56 full divisions in size. By comparison, it had about four when the war started in 1914, so it had exponentially grown to unforeseen levels. At the time, no other general has commanded an army of this size before in Britain, and certainly not in the conditions and circumstances like in World War One. But it's quite worth us having a bit of consideration of who Haig is, because he's going to be a general who's going to stay with us for quite a while now as we get into 1916 and go through the rest of the war. So Haig, who exactly is this man? Who is Mr. Douglas Haig? Well, he was a very experienced cavalry general who had fought in the Second Boer War in 1899 to 1901. And he believed that attack was the greatest principle of warfare that could be achieved. And so his strategy on the Western Front was going to follow the same initiative against the Germans. He was ambitious. He thrived on the desire to achieve major breakthroughs in his offensives. Clarify, when we say a breakthrough, this means a complete devastation of the enemy's side. So rather than just taking small ounces of ground or having small victories, he wanted to make massive sways, gain miles and miles of land, take and effectively win the war with big sweeping offensives that would just wipe out the opposition. In contrast, though, other generals at the time who were now beneath him, Herbert Plumer and Henry Rawlinson, they favoured what would eventually be categorised as a more bite and hold strategy, where they would seek limited objectives in smaller space and they would take them and then hold them against counterattacks until reinforcements could be brought up. But as leader, Haig's initiative was going to be given priority, and the drive for breakthroughs, the drive for victory, was always going to remain a main principle while he was in command. So, Allied high command between Britain and France, they wanted to initiate a new plan, a new offensive, because again, we have to understand, the war started back in July, August of 1914. We're now here at the end of 1915, and it's still going on. Not much has really changed on the Western Front. The Germans still hold lots of land, and of course, the Allied British and French forces are struggling to gain any ground back. And it just seems like it's all becoming a fruitless effort. As I said, hundreds and thousands of men are dying to gain this small ounce of land, but there's not really much to show for it. So in November 1915, the Allied High Command decided to come up with a new combined offensive between the French and British forces, and they agreed to strike at the River Somme. Why did they strike at the Somme? Well, essentially this was because it was where the British and French lines they naturally met. And so it was the idea that logistically it was the simplest way to coordinate. He, by contrast, had wanted to attack at Flanders. This was more battered ground, as you remember from the Battle of Ypres. He, of course, was a more vulnerable position, and he believed this was a great place to strike. He was facing resistance from the French commander, Joseph Joffre, who had insisted that it would be impractical given the need to move those soldiers across the British lines. Now, initially, France was going to lead the attack. As we said, France was the bigger force. It already had a stronger and larger French army under its command. It was not like Britain, who was relying on nearly a million men of new recruits to replace the dwindling BEF. And so it just seemed natural that it was going to be the fair way to do it. It would also be a great chance for Kitchener's PALS battalions to finally come to the fore and get some much needed combat experience. As we said, a quick reminder, we should remember the PAL battalions. These were men, local volunteers who were fighting alongside literally with their friends and family and workmates from the local villages and towns. They were a novice, if confident, force, and the majority of them had never even fought on the battlefield. And because of the consequences of what had happened at Lewes and Aubers Ridge, the original BEF was effectively lost. So it just seemed logical that France was going to lead the assault. However, a massive problem occurred. The German High Command actually struck first in February 1916. Their own leader, Falkenhayn, had convinced his fellow generals the best way to secure success in the war and break the stalemate was to eliminate France. As we said, they were the larger army between Britain and France at the time. He believed that the Germans could bleed France white. He was practicing a mass attritional campaign. So Verdun was a massive fort town and a big fortification area in France. It truthfully wasn't a strategically strong position for the French to actually maintain hold of, but it had a lot of symbolic history despite its minimal defences. And so on February 21st, a massive attack came in, and the fortress was indeed overwhelmed quite quickly. So the French commander Joffre had to deploy Philippe Pétain, a general, and his army to go and defend it. What followed would be a long, bloody attritional campaign as the Germans continued to mount the offensive, and more Frenchmen were deployed to stop this breach, this small gap in the line, turning into a breakthrough that would overwhelm them. By June, the artillery had devastated the land, and around 500,000 men had lost their lives. Because of this, the French had expended thousands of their own men to stop the Germans, and this meant the British were forced to increase their contributions for the Somme offensive. Suddenly now 19 British divisions were going to be deployed at the Somme, including their own territorial forces, while the French, by comparison, would only be providing around 6 divisions. This was against Haig's own desires, as the offensive was also going to be brought forward to July 1st, 1916, rather than August, removing his chance to ensure his men were going to be fully prepared. So, we'll quickly recap what the situation currently is for Haig and the British forces going into 1916. The plan now was to relieve the French at Verdun, and to do that, they were going to launch this new offensive at the Somme. This whole grand plan they initially had in 1915 of smashing through the line was going to be reduced in its impact. They were still going to aim for a breakthrough, and that was what they were hoping for. But now it was less about achieving that massive victory and more so providing relief for the French at Verdun. It was not initially the plan for Verdun to be the objective, but because of Falkenhayn's attack, this had changed things and meant they had to adapt their strategy. It was also now decided the British would be the ones leading the attack rather than the French. And as I want to really stress here, Haig was not for this. He really was against this idea. He wanted his soldiers to have more preparation, more training. He understood that they were still a novice force and so would be quite vulnerable on their first time in real major combat. It's also important to remember that the Somme was chosen out of convenience. It was not necessarily a strategically strong position to attack. Something we're going to touch upon in the next video is the German situation in the Somme, and how actually, despite initial beliefs, the Somme was actually going to be a tougher place to break through than some people initially believed. And of course, as I said, this is the first true test for the PALS battalions. These million men who were now civilian volunteers are going to take part in this conflict. What was going to happen to them? What was the first day going to be like? Well, that's what we're picking up in the next part of this series in my following video. Thank you, of course, for watching. I hope you found this quite insightful, quite useful. Do, of course, remember to consider subscribing, commenting how you found it. What's the most interesting thing that you've learned so far in our part on this series? I look forward to hearing from you. Do stick around in the class. Thank you for listening.